How are you? Welcome back to the channel. Now it's last week of March and it's all been a little bit frantic since you last saw me. We've had a great run of weather here in the UK and UK farmers are really making a lot of decisions regarding spring seed requirements. So much so I've actually struggled to leave the bank for last week of 10 days. So today's video comes to you from the Forage Guy HQ. I've brought myself down to a quieter end of the farm, but still those sounds of spring, tractors working in the background, birds singing in the trees and the occasional ewe and lamb shouting their head off across the brook may interrupt us. But today's video is an important one. We're going to be discussing maize, and in particular, told you, asking ourselves, what the FAO? So why is this an important video? Well, as we stand today, as I say, last week of March, there's around about 40% of UK farmers left to make their decisions regarding maize selections for the coming spring. FAO are an important factor when considering varieties that we're going to be growing. But what are FAOs? Well, FAOs relate to the maturity of a variety. They were introduced around about 10 years ago and replaced our existing maturity class system. Now, FAO stands for Food and Agricultural Organisation, and this was an international measure for varieties around the world and how they grow and how they mature. Some say that the FAO system is a little bit more complicated than the maturity class system that we had, but I disagree. It's just different, that's all. As soon as you get your head around it, it's quite easy to understand. The FAO ratings all relate to the amount of heat units that any variety requires to get up, grow, perform and do its thing. So as I say, FAO ratings all relate to the amount of heat units that any maize variety requires to get up and perform. It's actually the backbone of any initial conversation I would have with a UK maize grower. Really important that we get that FAO pinned down and make sure it matches the requirement. Yes, we can look at performance, but without that FAO, that's all largely irrelevant. When it comes to FAO, there's two limiting factors or considerations that we need to make. The first is your region, the second is time. First, your region. Are you in a more favourable region, therefore receiving more heat units on average? Conversely, are you in a more marginal region and therefore receiving less heat units on average? With regards to time, have you got a shorter growing window requirement? Is it going to be a later decision, or are you requiring a much earlier harvest to ensure that a following crop can be established in good order? Now, as a UK maize grower, do you know how many heat units you have available to you each year? Are you selecting varieties on that basis and matching it with the FAO requirements? Now, I've not left this side of the screen blank for no reason, just for cinematic benefit and a nice view. I'm going to use it to put information up during this video. Maps to give you some sort of guidance in terms of heat units in your region have been available for around about 10 years. Now, I would bear in mind that this data is 10 years old. We have seen some regions change and possibly become a little bit more favourable with the impacts of climate change during that period. But this does give you an overall average in terms of what varieties you could potentially grow regarding the heat units that you receive. If it is that you want to look in closer detail, there's also an app from Lima Grain that you can go on to, put into your postcode and give you that more detailed information regarding the heat units that you receive at your farm. Now, when it comes to any national data, there's always bits of grey area. There's always little bits of anecdotal information in there to consider as well. Utilising the likes of Lima Grain Maize Manager app to give you that finite detail in your region actually helps negate some of this. We know that in certain regions that on that overall data may look a little bit more marginal, possibly have a few microclimates in there. Conversely, you might appear to be in a more favourable region and something like altitude may have an impact in terms of the amount of heat units that your varieties could be receiving overall. In the UK, FAO ratings tend to range anywhere between 150 to around about 240. The varieties with the lower numbers, the FAO 150s, require less heat units. The higher the FAO number, so up to 240, require more heat units. Internally, we then categorise these down into ultra earlies, earlies and lates. Here in the UK, majority of mainstream maize varieties range anywhere between an FAO of 150 and a 240. The FAO varieties of 150 require less heat units than those that have an FAO of 240. The ultra early varieties require a minimum of 2,500 heat units to 2,700. The early varieties 2,700 to 2,900, and the late varieties require a minimum of 2,900 heat units to get up and perform and do their job. So that's the average heat units that those varieties require to perform. But we also do need to consider time. I've mentioned it already and it is a big limiting factor. For example, are you having maize grown for you, or are you growing maize with an arable rotation? You need to make sure that it's off in good order to make sure that that following wheat crop can be established. Or are you growing significant amounts of maize, therefore extended periods of time given to drilling? you need to adapt and change that variety selection to account for that amount of time and therefore the heat units that you receive during that period. So why is this all important now? As I say, with the last week of March, and there's around about 40% of the UK market left to make their decisions regarding maize variety selection. Over the last 2 years, we've seen 2 very challenging harvest periods in the autumn. Therefore, there's a lot of growers that are already making decisions around going earlier with the maturity of their varieties for this coming year. However, it does also create a lot of conversations around the performance of those varieties, and it's the data in particular that I'm going to talk about now. Now, traditionally, it's always been a general rule of thumb that as we go early with our variety selection in terms of maturity, there's always a perceived compromise in terms of performance. In particular, dry matter yields. Yes, we might be harvesting 2 to 3 weeks earlier, but we're paying the penalty in terms of overall dry matter performance. But is this always the case? Now, over the last 4 years, we've seen the dynamics of the UK maize market change quite significantly. In fact, there's been a 12% reduction in terms of the amount of late varieties that are purchased by UK maize farmers. That said, I appreciate Brexit would have played a big part of that. Some of that later material that used to come to the UK just simply can't get here anymore. However, we've also seen that 12% be replaced by the earlies and the ultra earlies. Again, last 2 seasons, UK farmers have reached for more early and ultra early harvesting varieties, but actually it's the performance that's coming from these varieties. UK breeders are getting more performance from those earlier varieties, therefore taking away that overall compromise or perceived compromise traditionally of decreased performance. Now, when it comes to quantifying the performance of any maize variety within the UK, we all tend to reach for the BSPB NIAB data that is produced on an annual basis for maize here in the UK. You'll find it in the majority of the maize guides and especially within the agri-maize guide here alongside me. If you like a copy, just drop me a message and I'll send you one. Now, I'm very fortunate to be part of the BSPB Maize Group who puts this data together on an annual basis. It's what we have to give that overall guidance in terms of variety selection for any given season. Now, when it comes to the BSPB data, it will always be a descriptive list. In contrast to a recommended list that we see for the likes of cereals, when it is that we're looking to achieve that data for the likes of forage in particular, it's very hard to get it down to that nth degree. In particular, performance around maturity of a certain variety on its given day. One of the biggest differences is actually maturity. If we look at wheat, for example, within national trials, there's a difference between 1 to maybe 3 days. For maize, there's a difference of up to 6 weeks between the later varieties and the ultra earlies. So how do we try and pin that down to a relative picture to create that data from? Well, the existing method has always been to do a 2-cut system. The trials for the BSPB descriptive list data for maize will always be taken in 2 cuts. The first cut being the ultra earlies and the earlies, and then a later cut of the later earlies and those later varieties to try and get an equal picture across the board and therefore create the most accurate data available for the UK maize farmer to make their selection from. But as I say, there's been some significant advances in terms of the variety performance from the ultra earlies and the early varieties in particular over the last few years. And therefore the BSPB are looking at ways that they can change their overall process in terms of harvesting varieties within trials. Why is that? It's because of the relative data that you're getting back as a UK grower to make the decision. And it's actually the biggest talking point to UK maize growers at this present time for the likes of myself who are discussing varieties that they're looking to move into. If it is that they're looking to produce an earlier harvest and get more from an earlier harvest, the first key question that always comes up is, am I still going to get that compromise in terms of overall performance? And this is understandable. If you're a UK maize grower looking to select an earlier harvesting variety, the first thing you're going to notice is a potential drop in overall dry matter yield compared to the later varieties. Now, what I would say is if we look back over the last 3 or 4 years, the BSPB descriptive list data shows the advances in terms of performance from the ultra earlies and the earlies versus the lates quite well. You can see that over time we have moved more yield into those earlier varieties. However, there's still a compromise, especially around those ultra earlies, and this is what we're going to discuss now. So if you are a UK maize grower who is looking to select an earlier variety for this coming season, the first thing your eye will be drawn to looking at those earlier varieties is a potential loss in terms of dry matter. However, if we look along the bottom of this table alongside me, you'll see that the data from the BSPB national trials is ranked in maturity in terms of dry matter percentage at harvest. This ranges all the way from 29% to 40% dry matter. If we look at the ultra earlies, for example, 40% dry matter, that's quite significant. Within the UK, within any either forage set up for livestock or AD, our target dry matter at harvest is going to be around about 30 to 32% dry matter. We will gain around about 2% dry matter per week as we lead up to harvest. Not only does that figure give you quite a good guidance in terms of the differences of how these varieties compare to each other in maturity, but it will also guide you in terms of just how much earlier they are in compared to the systems that you have at home. What I would say is the current system is in place. However, we are looking to adapt it to ensure that those relative dry matter yields are then also more relative to you as a UK farmer. Because what I would suggest is that taking a variety at 40% dry matter on paper compared to 32% in the field, yeah, you are going to question that overall performance initially. That said, even the varieties in the early category you can see are really giving those later varieties a run for their money in terms of dry matter yield in particular. Traditionally, there has always been the reason for selecting those later harvesting varieties because they are the highest dry matter yielding varieties. I get that. And again, some farmers who are growing significant amounts of maize tend to spread their harvest dates and therefore their drilling window over the late varieties and early varieties. What I would say and suggest is that actually now there's enough within the varieties, within the ultra earlies and the earlies, to spread that harvest date still, but get your harvest earlier overall without taking that overall big compromise in terms of yield. What I would also suggest is that, as I say, use the on-paper data to give you some sort of guidance, but always judge that between on-paper performance and in the field performance. As you can see alongside me here, this is within national trials. You have an ultra early within Lato of an FAO 150 versus Resolute here at an FAO of 190. The overall information on the BSPB descriptive list data within any maize guide that you may read doesn't necessarily paint this picture. You would have thought that actually from the potential dry matter yield loss within the official data, that this variety on the left hand side, with it being Lato there, would have been significantly shorter and therefore overall a lot less high yielding. As you can see, they're shoulder to shoulder. The only big difference though is maturity. Now another key consideration comes within that ultra early category. You'll see that compared to the rest of the list, there's not actually that many of them to choose from. That's because they're genetically as far removed from what maize should be as possible. One key consideration to make within that sector is how they get to that maturity. Traditionally, we've seen that some varieties have become ultra earlies because of the way that they mature. I would argue they don't mature. They technically die. They get to a certain phase and then literally just switch off. This is fine if you've got a forager sat in your yard waiting to go when that crop makes that decision. But if that isn't the case, you'll be chasing your tail and possibly have significant losses. We need to make sure that even the ultra earlies have that stay green ability, have that wider window in terms of harvest, and can stand there and wait for you to harvest them if the conditions break, not you chasing them out the field to try and rescue that crop before it goes too far. Be aware that if the variety that you're looking to select does not appear within BSPB descriptive list data, the official data that it might be marketed with is most probably European. What I would say is that with regards to FAOs, they aren't always necessarily transferable. One FAO in another country isn't necessarily replicated in terms of its performance, especially in a maritime UK climate, so something always worth bearing in mind, especially in terms of what might be perceived as an early variety. Chances are it probably won't perform and give you that earlier harvest date which you require from that initial variety selection. Another consideration to make is actually how these FAOs are used. Some breeders have a little bit of poetic license in terms of where they see a variety sitting, but also how they categorise and where we see that cut-off between the ultra earlies and the earlies. We saw this a lot last year as growers really moved towards those early variety selections. You'll be speaking to UK farmers and they say, yeah, I really like the look of this ultra early variety. Actually, it's not ultra early, it's an early. You could have got 2 weeks earlier in terms of harvest date, but it just depends on how that variety has been marketed and where that line in the sand is drawn by any either distributor or breeder in terms of what they perceive to be early or ultra early. Just something to bear in mind. Now what I would say is if you are a grower who has looked to grow an earlier variety over the last couple of seasons because of the harvest conditions that we have received, if it is you're selecting a much earlier variety than you're traditionally used to growing, you need to manage that variety. Remember that that variety will be being harvested potentially 2 to 3, maybe even 4 weeks earlier than you're used to. This last season we saw quite a lot of maize that was around about 30 to 32% dry matter around about the end of September. Then the weather broke. On reflection, a lot of those maize crops could have been harvested ahead of the weather. A lot of the feedback after the rain then cleared and the conditions started to dry was that maize had potentially gone too far. That was because actually it was right at the end of September and we could have gone. Now, another limiting factor regarding early variety selection can be the seed cost. It goes without saying that the ultra early and early varieties do tend to be a little bit more expensive when it comes to a seed purchase. But why is that? That's because those varieties are so far removed from what maize genetically should be. There's been so much time, money and investment put into those varieties by breeders to get them where they are for the UK market. Now, what I would also say is if you're looking at a variety that's being marketed as an ultra early or an early variety but doesn't carry that seed cost, I'd question it, especially if it isn't on the descriptive list. It may well be that that variety is being marketed as early for the European market, but not necessarily for the UK market. What I would also say is that when it comes to harvest, yes, you might have been able to save yourself £10 a bag on seed costs, but for the last 2 years, if it is that you've got a variety that you've saved a bit of money on, but it's 2 to 3 weeks later than you planned, and you've got maize standing out in a field with the conditions that we've just had, if I could offer you a service that means that you could pay another £10 and your maize would have been harvested 3 weeks ago, you would probably have seen that as a good return on investment. So in summary, making sure we get the FAO of these maize varieties right is really important, isn't it? From those initial conversations that you have at the beginning of any season, making sure that the FAO matches not only your region, but your rotational requirements too. You now know how to find the overall heat units required for any variety in your region, and we've also discussed the overall performances of them. We've looked at the differences between the lates, the earlies and the ultra early varieties and how they compare to each other. The advances that have been brought from the early to the ultra early variety sectors over the last couple of years in particular, but also the context around the official list data and how that might be perceived still as a bit of a compromise. But what I would say is after the last 2 seasons that we've had, regardless of your variety selection, especially within that later category, chasing for that overall dry matter yield, no matter how high yielding it is, if you can't harvest it in good time, you will see a compromise as well. So going forward, ultra early varieties, they are there, they are options for you, not only from a performance but also from an environmental point of view, making sure that we can establish that following crop within the rotation behind it, limiting that risk at harvest time, maximising overall performance from our maize varieties. If you are uncertain and you want to see these varieties and how they perform side by side, utilise local maize days to you. Agri have a number of sites throughout the UK in any given year. Get yourself along to one of those open days and see how they perform in the field versus on paper. As ever, please leave me a comment down below. Any questions I'm more than happy to take. And please like, share, subscribe and ring the little bell. And I'll see you for the next one. Bye for now.